Mr. President, members of the Executive Board, colleagues and friends, I welcome you to this first regular session of the UNDP Executive Board in 2020. Allow me to begin by congratulating His Excellency Mr. Walton Webson, the permanent representative of Antigua and Barbuda, on his election as the President of the Board. I very much look forward to working with you and also the new Bureau members who have been elected and have joined us in overseeing the governance of our organization during this year. Let me also express my gratitude to the outgoing President, His Excellency Mr. Cho Tae-yul, the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea, for his dedicated leadership of the Board in 2019 and all the wise counsel and advice that he provided us with. I also want to thank the outgoing Board members for all their invaluable support and warmly welcome their successors in the Bureau. Let me also express my appreciation, I think I do so on behalf of both Member States and the organization as a whole, that in the Bureau we have permanent representatives taking the leadership role. It is a significant step in terms of acknowledging the strategic significance of the discussions that this Board conducts, in addition to the transactional, the governance and the oversight functions that it fulfills. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this morning, however, I begin with something that may not seem quite commensurate with the seriousness of so many developments in our world today. You have before you a strange package, perhaps, that you have not yet opened. Some of you may have, and then will have discovered that this is not more literature, it's not a USB stick, it is actually a chocolate bar. Why do I come to you at the Executive Board meeting with a chocolate bar? Well, first of all, because I think it may put you in a better mood as we try and discuss what we have accomplished and what we did not accomplish in 2019. But more importantly, one can sometimes talk in the abstract, and in the United Nations we often talk in averages and in global figures and in trends, and we sometimes do not see that actually what changes people's lives are very specific things. This chocolate bar carries a number of stories within it. First of all, it connects us to farmers of cocoa in Ecuador. People who may never have heard of the United Nations will probably never set foot in this building here. And yet, through decisions that you took, that we have taken over the past year, are connected to this organization and to the idea of the United Nations through the production of cocoa. But why was it necessary to have a connection to UNDP in this context? Well, farmers producing cocoa are primary product producers. They do not benefit a great deal from the market prices and particularly from the product prices that are paid at the consumer end, first of all. And so a year ago, when we established the country investment facility to try and provide our country teams with some capital with which to explore new solutions and ideas, our team in Ecuador began a project that 12 months later has literally hit the global marketplace. It began with the cocoa producers because they are the reality of the product. But we then began to explore with an organization in the Netherlands also the potential of using blockchain to connect producers and consumers and to also allow consumers to become stakeholders in not just cocoa production but in fair pricing, in reinvesting some of their resources in a farmer's ability to expand their production, but also to grow trees, thereby contributing to addressing the adaptation needs and mitigation needs in times of climate change. And out of this has grown a product that is now beginning to be traded on the world market, which literally allows you, if you open it and you look here, to point your QR reader. And for those of you who are not yet perhaps digitally literate, a QR reader is something you can install on your smartphone, and it allows you to connect straight to the farmer who actually grew the cocoa in this chocolate. It allows you also to do something that we consider extremely important, because this chocolate will not use any of its revenues for advertising. All that money that has been saved from advertising is contained in tokens that are here on this little symbol, and that with your phone you can then make a decision. You can either reinvest that money straight with the farmer, enabling them to plant more trees, or you can use it to buy your next chocolate bar. Either way, you are part of a circular connection that we have established between producers and consumers. Using the latest of digital technology, but also starting where farmers were struggling to survive as cocoa producers, also making a fairer trade possible, and ultimately making consumers and producers on different sides of the world part of a common effort. Not just in the idea, is it a classic United Nations proposition, but it is also a very practical demonstration of what partnerships, in this case between farmers, a government in Ecuador, a company that is establishing new trading platforms with blockchain, and the United Nations Development Program could do by connecting them and curating a platform on which you today will hopefully very much enjoy, because it's actually very nice tasting chocolate. I wanted to show you this because I do believe that sometimes when we sit in this hall here, it is difficult to relate to that universe of activity that we in UNDP can summarize in so many different ways. 2,800 projects, $5 billion, activities in 170 countries, 17,000 staff working across the world. It is in some ways the aggregate that, yes, sounds impressive, but it is when you disaggregate it and you start seeing how individual projects, interventions and actions sometimes can be fundamentally transformative on the ground. I cannot, and we cannot present to you a summary of results here that comes even close to doing justice to that reality. But I will try my best in the next few minutes to provide you with results, because this board meeting is about discussing results, and it is about results that are both in the financial operational domain of the organization UNDP, which is accountable to you as a board, as it is also for the results that we are delivering in those countries we serve, with resources provided both by donor countries, but more and more frequently also by the countries themselves who finance the involvement of UNDP, and how we contribute both to national priorities and overarching global objectives in which the development program of the United Nations, and by extension the whole development system of the UN, is a very critical part. 2019, as you will recall, was a complex year in terms of events around the world, but also in terms of the rollout of the UN Development System reform. For UNDP, both the development context, the 2030 agenda, but also the changes inside the UN demanded of us a very significant effort in trying to both advance the organization, support reform, address new areas of service and the offer, so to speak, that UNDP would provide to countries, which we had foreshadowed in the strategic plan that you adopted, and at the same time try and stabilize an organization that literally on the 1st of January lost its entire leadership cadre at country level. I think in retrospect, we almost underestimated quite how significant a moment that was for the organization, and I'm going to, in the next few minutes, just give you a brief overview of how we have managed through this year and how I do indeed stand before you in January 2020 and can say that the organization in financial and operational terms is stable. We have managed the transition without too much disruption, although I will point to a few areas where disruption was inevitable and therefore also of consequence to delivery. And above all, to also demonstrate that while all this transformation, reform and transition was happening, the organization continued to invest in that future development offer that is so critical and central to the strategic plan period in which we are operating. In a nutshell, at the beginning of January, without all the figures yet fully confirmed, I can say that we will have completed 2019 again with a balanced budget. This may seem something that you would expect of an organization, but actually, as you know, in our multilateral system, in our world of today, this is not a given, and I'm very proud and grateful to the many who contributed to this result being possible. We have no deficit. We had another clean audit last year. We are able to invest resources in the development of the program, and we're able to maintain that infrastructure that is so central to the functioning of the whole UN development system. Contributions, however, were a little bit lower in 2019, in part explainable by individual events, for example, the financial crisis in Argentina and other such factors, which obviously in an organization where 89% of its revenue is project-based and significant individual projects or events in individual countries can affect the overall contributions. But at least for now, nothing in that underlying trend would point to something that should make us worried that we are facing a structurally negative direction, but nevertheless a challenge and something we have to manage. The good news is that in fact, when it comes to core and non-core, I want to commend 9 countries who last year in fact, increased their core contribution to UNDP. This is the first significant change in direction for over 5 years. I also have to say it's a little bit frustrating because that significant turnaround, that is somewhere between 5 to 10% of core that has increased in 2019, was essentially not wiped out completely, but largely eliminated by exchange rate fluctuations where the dollar appreciated, and therefore the contributions of countries that sometimes were literally in the millions of euros or their national currencies were to some extent neutralized in the appreciation of the dollar. So in a balance sheet sense, we are not that much further than we were last year, which is, as I say, frustrating. But that is more something that is totally outside the control of the organization. Financial markets do not operate in the interests of UNDP. However, I do consider the trend of growing core contributions, and if you take them in their national currency denominations, in some cases literally more than 10% by countries, as a significant indication of a growing sense of trust. And from that perspective, I continue again to appeal to you that, as you will see again today and in the deliberations this week, the challenge of managing an organization mandated with a strategic plan, with a key and core function within the UN development system, will to some extent also perform better and more efficiently and effectively to the extent that we can correct this extreme imbalance that is there at the moment. Overall, delivery also for 2019 has improved. We increased it from 90 to 96%, and I want to particularly commend the Regional Bureau for Africa, which in 2019 indeed delivered 101% of its actual planned delivery for 2019. And I mention this because, again, I want to remind you that in January of 2019, virtually every country office team of UNDP on the African continent lost its resident representative. They moved into the resident coordinator function as of the 1st of January, and the teams essentially had to manage a transition where we then had to deploy our new resident representatives in the first 6 months of 2019, and despite that, the Bureau managed to sustain implementation, and we saw across the board in UNDP in the third and fourth quarter a significant uptake as the new leadership was able to bring its managerial leadership to these individual projects. We made significant progress also in advancing on some of the more operational sides, the clustering of business, services, and processes. Right now, we are in the midst of a major effort to take 57 business processes, and I will not take you into the details, but they are a significant proportion of what makes an organization operate every day, clustering them and putting them in global shared services centers, which will not only enhance the effectiveness and efficiency, it will also generate over the next few years significant gains, we hope, in terms of cost effectiveness. UNDP is not a small operation because it does not only administer the entitlements and benefits of the roughly 17,000 staff and consultants who work with UNDP, it actually offers these services to the UN system as a whole. So every month we transact roughly entitlements and benefits for 27,500 staff across the UN. It's one of those classic backbone services that we provide, and annually transact over 600,000 voucher payments. Again, I want to give you a sense of the magnitude. When we invest in these business process innovations, they can have significant impacts on what happens next. Alongside that, we have a new mobile app that we can use. We have a new travel and expense module that is set to save 40% of time compared to before. And again, I only mention these as brief examples because in the course of the midterm review, the actual numbers of these innovations in our business and operations processes will also become more measurable and more judgeable. The deployment of staff was not only in 2019 an entire new cadre of resident representatives, over 120 I think, it was also a whole new generation of deputy resident representatives. So in total, over 240 senior managers in our country level operations were taken through a selection process, scrutinized, appointed, inducted, and deployed on the ground. Gender parity is now something that we have achieved in UNDP, and I only mention it not to go into the details. It includes our executive group, it includes the resident representatives, it includes the Assistant Secretary General's level, and throughout the organizations we are coming closer and closer to having gender parity virtually across all levels, with some remaining, particularly in the senior and mid-level management, that we still need to address. We are working on new contract modalities. We're investing in new skills with our staff. The People for 2030 strategy includes 9 tracks of trying to focus on that capital that UNDP represents, namely its staff, its people, as an integral part of a more efficient and more effective organization. One example simply being that as part of the new UNDP digital strategy that you have heard about, the most popular training module taken up by staff last year across the organization was the digital training module. 1,200 staff enlisted in that first generation of upgraded skills training, and 500 are currently involved in a higher level masterclass, so to speak. We are in the midst of making UNDP staff not redundant because they weren't trained as digital experts, but rather digitally literate so that they can be part of what we have promised to member states to deliver with our new program skills. There are also other areas in the financial, in the operation, the human resources domain that we tackled with great priority. Addressing the issue of sexual misconduct. Not only is the strategy and action plan in full implementation, we have hired additional investigators, we have put new helplines in place, we have identified high-risk countries for which we have appointed SEA focal points. We are trying to respond not only to your expectations, but to many of the calls we have received from our own staff. Many sad, tragic stories still are hidden within the history of our organization as a whole. Some of them we can never undo. But as we move forward, we will continue to do what we have promised ourselves and you, that there is literally no tolerance for this kind of behavior. I hope that we can live up to that expectation, that our systems of investigation and the ability and the courage of staff to believe that it is worthwhile, in the simplest sense of the word, to try and report these incidents will actually make this a less and less likely experience to live through. Let me briefly turn to the programmatic side of our results and say to you, it is difficult to speak to you about results in any way that you can now say, well, let's tick off certain categories. So I will try to do 2 things, and certainly our reports, the informals, and much of what we will also transact with you over the next 3 to 4 months as the midterm review of the strategic plan is completed, is essentially to allow you to judge whether the institution is moving in the right direction. One thing we did in 2019 was to focus on 3 overarching themes against which we wanted everyone in the organization to ask themselves, is what I am doing in the project that I'm employed in, focused on, delivering on the ground, am I contributing to a larger portfolio of activities? We picked 3 areas that we felt the world was seized with and in which the development narrative and contribution is central to what happens next at national level and globally. And you will recall that I've remarked already a few times in our board meetings that UNDP's truly unique value proposition lies not that it is always going to be the best project implementer of a project or that it is the best global synthesizer of an issue at global level. It is its ability to combine that capacity of acting on the ground alongside governments and supporting them with a global set of objectives, be they climate change, be it preventing violent extremism, be it inequality. And it is that which we wanted to test and push the boundaries last year when we picked climate change, inequality, and the root causes of migration and internal displacement. UNDP is the largest climate services provider in terms of projects and volume inside the United Nations family, but they are often funded with vertical funds, the GEF, the Green Climate Fund, bilaterals. How do we best combine that ability to be active in 140, 150 countries on climate change, and yet when it comes to being part of a global effort in the context of the UN's Framework Convention, much of that remains just individual projects. It is the climate promise that led us to respond to the Secretary General's call in September when he brought the world here to New York to say, can UNDP be a significant offer by the Secretary General to countries who commit to higher levels of ambition to also support them and not simply call on them? Out of that grew our climate promise, a commitment to 100 countries between last year and October of this year to assist them in the review of their nationally determined contributions, their national climate strategies, the only vehicle that they have available and that the Convention has available to arrive in Glasgow with anything approximating credibility that the Convention and the Paris Agreement are in fact working. based on national interest, supported at the national level. That is UNDP's strength, but then enabling the world to have a series of national climate strategies that live up to that promise of every 5 years, countries will review their level of ambition. Nothing less will protect the Paris Agreement from actually being continuously endorsed by countries, but also to lead our global climate effort. Alongside that, we have also set ourselves the objective, because if countries are being asked to reduce their emissions, what is UNDP as an organization doing? Our climate promise includes that commitment to reduce our emissions by 25% by 2025 and by 50% by the year 2030. We always said we do not yet know how we're going to do this, but that is actually the reality of many countries too. And yet it is what it is. And we must be judged as an organization of being at least as capable and committed as that which the world is asking of countries, often with less means and resources even than are available to us. Let me also say that if you combine the portfolio, again talking about results of these many GF and GCF funded projects at national level, we estimate that the amount of CO2 emissions avoided is the equivalent of taking 59 million cars off the road every year. Does that number tell you something? Well, it tells you, first of all, that we are trying to measure the total impact of these projects, but it also gives you a sense of magnitude. 59 million cars is not an insignificant contribution to what countries are able to do. And sometimes the action starts with a very simple step, and I can just tell you that the one car that we have here at UNDP's headquarters has just been downsized and upgraded. A smaller car, but now a fully electric vehicle for the first time in our history, the most normal thing that one could do. It's not that complicated sometimes, but you just need to get on and do it. Second focus is inequality. And you will remember that in December we launched the UN Human Development Report, very much focused on inequality. And I hope it has brought to many of you that ability that you have asked of us frequently, which is to also provide the thought leadership, the ability to connect dots across many different development realities. And clearly 2019 was a disturbing year. Whenever you switched on your television, you read the newspapers, we saw people stepping out onto the streets in very different places, in unexpected places, and essentially the dissatisfaction, the frustration, moving into a protest mode because the feeling that governments and elites and their institutions that are meant to represent them are simply not delivering. That report was, in many respects, a next generation attempt to bring the Human Development Report capacity back into the center of this debate. And I must say the response, both by leaders across the world and also by the media, which reported on what is a complex topic and not an easy to digest report, was remarkable. It's some of the most serious reporting I have seen on any report in the last 2 years that we have released, and speaks and I think acknowledges the resonance that this work has had for our work. UNDP is very much committed to deliver that thought leadership in the context of the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, leaving no one behind. This is the most read and downloaded report in the world on development. If we get it right, we can help people across the globe to tackle some of these issues hopefully more effectively and with greater collaboration also. And it speaks to other elements, whether it is gender, whether it is the issue of disability, whether it is discrimination based on HIV or sexual orientation or religion or ethnicity. All of this is woven into an understanding of what inequality represents in today's world and how fundamentally disruptive it has become to the fabric of our societies, our nations, and the governance process, which is why UNDP's central offer on governance, on rule of law, on the issues of fundamental rights, but also on elections, is so central and in such high demand across every continent we work in. The third area that we picked then for 2019 to bring our colleagues in UNDP to realize that their individual projects are part of a larger portfolio was the root causes of migration and internal displacement. And again, many people said, well, is this really an area for UNDP? Isn't this IOM? Isn't it UNHCR? Well, colleagues, I have to say to you, sometimes these discussions surprise me inside UNDP and outside, because everything, including our Secretary General from the beginning of his tenure, focused on the notion of prevention. development in its larger sense of the word is a fundamental tool of prevention. It is the investment in addressing issues that, if they are left unaddressed, will make people get up and leave, will force people to leave the place they call home. This is why development is such a central and integral part in actually trying to address this issue of migration, refugees, displacement. Over 70 million people are last year forced to leave their homes. This is no longer an episodic crisis. It's a systemic issue, and we have seen how much it has begun to dominate sometimes discussions even in development cooperation. Our objective in UNDP is not to subsume the development objective under a migration or internal displacement agenda, but rather to realize that if you do not invest in development, you're actually, by default, already allowing larger numbers of people to be forced to become refugees, internally displaced people. And I think sometimes it is important that we understand as UNDP how central our work with countries is to helping address precisely this phenomenon where people decide to leave the place they call home because they either have no hope, they cannot grow their food anymore, there is no more water, or conflict has become so intense as a result of climate change or many other factors that fleeing is the only option. We are all struggling to cope with this. And let me take just 1 minute here to mention the last visit that I just completed last week to Sudan. I urge you all to remember the revolution in Sudan. It is almost dropped off our television screens and news channels. There are other crises, there are other more dominant stories, and yet in Sudan, it was the young people of Sudan and the women in that society who managed to accomplish something that neither the international community, Hollywood stars, the International Criminal Court, or whoever did not succeed, which is to, in a sense, give the Sudanese an option to choose their leadership. I spent 3.5 days in Sudan, and I was struck by the extraordinarily positive energy that is unfolding there in a region that so often is simply characterized by international perceptions as defined by conflict, violent extremism, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda. And yet here is a country that managed in 6 months of a standoff to then negotiate a transitional government, to put in place a democratic pathway towards elections in 32 months from now, and do all this while facing a bankrupt state, a desperate nation in which food and fuel are still scarce, in which humanitarian needs are still dramatic. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, if we take the notion of development and prevention seriously, then let me tell you, here is one country that merits all our attention. I was struck by how desperately frustrated, but also, in a sense, lost many people in Sudan feel at the moment, because at a moment where they had hoped the international community would help them step forward, we seem to be watching with a degree of ambivalence, some inertia. There was a humanitarian pledging conference in London just a few weeks ago, and excellent. It is urgently needed. But let me tell you right now, this country and every single person I met in Sudan said what we now need is the development pathway. We need to invest in getting out of this situation, and we cannot do this with a bankrupt state. We need the international community. So let me say, if you want one test case for our collective thinking about what it is to talk about prevention, about nexus, about development opportunities as a way of reducing conflict, stabilizing governance and democratic governance and the rule of law, then Sudan should be a collective test for all of us. Mr. President, I end by saying to you that in overall terms, 2019 was a year in which we faced many challenges and to some extent organizational stresses. But I want to thank you above all for having given us the flexibility and the opportunity to prove to you 3 things. The United Nations Development Programme has been part of the engine that has driven the reform agenda of the Secretary General for the UN Development System. I hope we will never forget that on the 1st of January, it was UNDP's cooperation with the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General that allowed resident coordinators in over 128 countries to assume their offices. Our support platform, our new business management platforms that we have developed to support these resident coordinators in running their offices are just part of the story, alongside many of the processes to do with the new UN Sustainable Development Corporation, from the multi-country office review, the regional review, the management accountability framework, many of the tools, my chairing of the core group of the UN SDG, and many, many other processes are exemplary, I believe, in terms of our commitment to make this reform work. What happens next is not, in the first instance, a single responsibility of any individual institution. It is how both the theory of change and our culture and our conduct will play itself out at country level. This is an experiment that is no longer in the laboratory. It is now in full motion. It is in full implementation. And I hope we will continue to see significant advances in the core objectives that you sought to achieve with the reform. And one key piece of that remains that notion of integration, which I always say is a key challenge to UNDP, but it is not a singular mandate of UNDP. But we take very seriously our role within the UN country teams, within the UN development system, to drive that competence of the UN as a whole, but principally and first of all as an offer to the countries how to achieve more integrated outcomes in terms of the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals logic, and principally in terms of national development priorities and strategies. That must be the yardstick against which the value of UNDP should be judged and measured in the years to come. At the end of the day, we are there not to get on better as a system, we are there to deliver better as a system, and that remains the focus with which we engage at the country level, but also in the global driving of the UN Sustainable Development Group under the leadership of the SG and the DSG. In the meantime, I did not spend much time today on particular initiatives, but you will already be able to judge in the year 2020 significant outcomes of what I described alongside the UNDS reform and managing through the year 2019, the investment in innovation, in trying to sharpen the offer that UNDP can provide to the countries it serves and to the international community as a whole. Our strategic plan put a significant focus on delivering over 4 years a new contemporary offer. The future of development in terms of the landscape is defining that. The establishment of our Sustainable Finance Hub is a good example of how we are achieving very rapid synergies and also creating new ways in which we can assist governments on one of the central priorities that they have defined in the development arena. Financing, leveraging private finance, new forms of looking at SDG budgeting, all this is part of where UNDP is engaged in most countries around the world already, but we are, I think, developing very significant new offers, not least SDG Impact, which you will see launched in a few months' time as a key platform to address, for example, the opportunities for leveraging private sector investment and capital at national level and in domestic markets. The digital UNDP strategy is in full swing, and again, in the informals, I think you have already received some briefings. In less than 20 months, we will have a differently operating organization in place. This is the objective. It's not the end of a digital journey and transformation of UNDP, but it will be noticeably different. It will be both digitized, and it will have taken digitalization into the core of many of the offers that we are developing for countries to work on, be it in governance and e-government systems, be it, for example, in connecting producers with global markets, or be it in many of the data priorities that we have identified for development decision-making. Our business model is being reformed as we speak, and we have to address the fact that the financing of development is very different in the future from simply looking at a funding model for development organizations. This is a task that is not only elementary and central to UNDP's future viability, it actually speaks to an entire, if you want, group of institutions in the development arena, and we are learning a great deal from others and hopefully providing our own leadership inputs here. The notion of innovation, the country investment facility, the innovation facility, but also the accelerator labs, which we launched last year, and alongside all the other things I described, we now have 60 UNDP accelerator labs firmly integrated in our country teams, covering 78 countries, and the initial indications are that they have become a vital asset to precisely that which we promised you, namely a UNDP country team and a UNDP development offer that is increasingly focused on the solutions that are emerging from within the country and then connecting it to our global network, which is also part of perhaps the greatest challenge we still face. When you have 17,000 staff, you often wonder, well, isn't that an enormous army? But when you're spread across 170 countries, you very quickly realize that it can be very thin. One of the key objectives we have to accomplish over the next year and a half is to find new ways of mobilizing that expertise across the organization, to instantly connect an office with the expert and the expertise in another office, because connecting the development frontiers of practice and innovation is what countries often look for to UNDP. This is a core part where we have not been able to crack some of the basic operational challenges, but we remain firmly focused on how it is that this can be delivered. Mr. President, I end by saying that the year 2020 is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Much of what I've tried to briefly touch on in my presentation speaks to one very fundamental hypothesis and proposition also in the United Nations. What began as a response to the scourge of war and very much focused on how to help nations and the peoples of the world to avoid war and, put positively, to secure peace, increasingly became linked also to what we today call the development dimension of the United Nations work. In that logic of the 75th anniversary, the origins of the United Nations, I believe that whether we conduct these discussions in the humanitarian development peace nexus narrative, whether we take a preventive lens, or whether we just look at development in the spirit of Professor Amartya Sen, who once framed it in very simple terms. Development is freedom. Development is about choices. Development is about the freedom to not be imprisoned by your economic reality, whether as an individual or as a nation, a developing nation. That remains the fundamental premise with which I think we in UNDP approach the 75th anniversary as representing not only a vital moment, as the Secretary General has had to reflect on the role and value of the United Nations, but also to be clear how central the development promise as a partnership, as an act of solidarity, as support in sometimes extremely difficult times like conflict, or indeed when, such as China currently faces with the coronavirus, moments where the international community must come together to support a country, express solidarity, be able to mobilize, as our colleague, the Director General of the World Health Organization, has done, an offer of support, but also help the world manage something that only collectively can we succeed in managing. UNDP is a firm, central and integral part of that UN promise that development ultimately is the best tool for achieving peace, for avoiding war, and for realizing the promise of the United Nations, and in today's world of the 2030 Agenda. Thank you so much.